Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 27th of March of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Sumy direction. We have very important statement made by the President of Ukraine, Zelensky. Russia is preparing a new offensive in Sumy and Kharkiv regions. That was stated by Zelensky. He says it will begin this spring. I can confirm that Putin is trying to buy time and is preparing for a spring offensive. We see preparations for this upcoming operation. We have shared intelligence with our allies. We must look at the situation with our eyes wide open. So that was the statement of the President of Ukraine. And you know that when talking about Russian offensive operation in Sumy, there is nothing, let's say, unexpected. There is nothing that can surprise us, because this is the priority target for the Russians. Of course, not to establish complete control over the city of Sumy, but to create a secure zone. You know that after the Russians finished their first stage of the pipeline offensive operation, when they managed basically to defeat the Ukrainians and when the Ukrainian lines collapsed, before the end of the entire counter-offensive operation in the Sumy direction, according to different sources, we start receiving report that the Russians began redeploying their forces back to their original positions. The Russians began redeployment of their forces to the Zaporizhia direction, to the South Donetsk direction, to the Pokrovsk directions, to the city of Toretsk, Chasiv and Kupiansk. And when the Ukrainians saw that, they realized that in the very near future, one of these, let's say, directions we've just discussed could be reinforced significantly, which can be a turning point on this or that direction, on this or that front line. And Zelensky realized that he can't allow the Russian doing this. So that's why several weeks ago the Ukrainians began their own offensive operation in the Belgorod direction, and as a result of clashes during the previous several weeks, the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions a bit. The Ukrainians established control over some part of the village of Demidovka, according to information of course we have, and according to the geolocations. Also, the Ukrainians managed to reach the outskirts of the settlement of Popovka. According to different sources, the Ukrainians carried out several attacks in this area, but all of them were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians suffered losses and were forced to fall back. As for the 27th of March of 2025, now the Ukrainians are focused on destroying bridges, on destroying logistics, with the purpose to not allow the Russians to counterattack and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. Now the Russians in Demidovka, Popovka and Grafovka appeared in a very difficult situation. They have very big problems with logistics. The Russians can't use regular roads for these purposes. They can use just old and not very comfortable roads that goes through fields and through different, let's say, not very good areas. Anyway, the Russians are not encircled. There is no such like a cauldron or something like this, but the situation with logistics is not very good. So, and this attack of course forced the Russians to change their plans and to stop the redeployment process from the Sumy direction, let's say in the direction of the old front line. And the Russians most likely came to the conclusion that first they need to create a buffer zone, or the secure zone. And most likely there are several settlements that are going to become the first target for the Russians. We are talking of course about the settlement of Yunakivka, the settlement of Miropolye, and the settlement of Ugroidi. So these three villages currently is the primary target for the Russians. So let's discuss where exactly the Russians are located right now and how far are the Russians from these areas. First, let's talk about Yunakivka. As you can see, according to different statements, according to different videos and many other things, we have adjusted the map in this area, and we have adjusted the map completely in the Russian favor without any contested area or something like this. Today, the Russian sources published the video which confirms the presence of the armored force of the Russian Federation on the territory of the block post, on the territory of the checkpoint between the Russian border, Russian territory and the territory of Ukraine. In this video we can see 3 Russian soldiers that were waving with 1 Russian flag on the territory of the border crossing position by the name of Suja. So now we have no doubts that the Russians, at least in this area, reached the border. This video of course was immediately geolocated exactly above this construction. The Russians were waving their flag. Based Based on this video, we have adjusted everything on top from this icon in the Russian favor. Now let's compare the map to understand how exactly the map changed. This is the situation, for example, by the end of the 26th of March of 2025, and this is the situation by the end of the 27th of March. So the Russians managed to take under control significant number of territories. And despite this Russian progress and very difficult situation for the armed forces of Ukraine, both the Russians and the Ukrainians confirmed that there is still resistance, and that there is a still pocket of resistance of the armed forces of Ukraine between the villages of Oleshny and Gogolivka. But telling the truth, I see no future for this pocket of resistance, because the Russians, as you can see, managed to take this pocket in cauldron, managed to take this pocket in pincers. The Russians can now in the very near future to begin offensive operation from this border checkpoint in the southern directions towards the border. And if the Russians are able to improve their positions for another kilometer and to attack Oleshny from the north, then Ukrainians that are currently located in Gogolivka would be caught in complete cauldron. Furthermore, the Russians are advancing from the village of Milovoy in the western direction with the same purposes to attack the settlement of Oleshny. And today we received another geolocation, another article published by the neutral mappers, that the Russians indeed managed to improve their positions. Once again, this is the situation by the end of the 26th of March, and this is the situation by the end of the 27th of March. And we believe that due to this difficult situation, the Ukrainians will be forced this upcoming night between the 27th and the 28th of March to fall back from these territories towards the village of Loknya, because otherwise they would be caught in cauldron once again. So we see that the Russians are about to finish the battle for the western part of Sudzha, and then there are going to be just two settlements left under the Ukraine control. We are talking about the village of Garnal and the village of Guiva. As for the settlement of Guiva, today two very reliable sources, the Telegram channel of the Group of Forces North, the Group of Forces North in the Telegram channel made another post where they reported that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to answer the village of Guiv itself from the north. And also some pro-Russian mappers adjusted this part of the village also in the Russian favor. So once again, at least 10 or 15% of the settlement of Guiv is already under complete Russian control by the end of the 27th of March. And after the fall of Guiv, just one village left. So when talking about this direction, we see that the Russians have already crossed the border at several places. We discussed the situation in the previous videos. The Russians entered the village of Volodymyrovka, Veselovka, Zhuravka, Basovka, and now the Russians are about to cross the border to the east of Yunakivka. And with this, let's say, raid, most likely in 2-3 weeks, the battle for the village of Yunakivka begins. But I have some doubts whether the Russians are going to move further, and the main problem why the Russians can't move further so fast is very huge forest between the city of Sumy and the border with the Russian Federation. We are talking about these territories. You can see the biggest forest ever, and we telling the truth, I'm not sure whether the Russians are able to save the rate of their offensive, to save their, let's say, kilometers per day of offensive when they enter this territory. It's going to be very difficult to attack through this territory. The only solution for the Russians, most of all, to outflank the city of Sumy from the west, but then this is going to be completely different offensive operation. Anyway, after the fall of Guiv and Garnal, we expect Russian offensive in Myropilya. And telling the truth, Zelensky says that this is going to be a very huge offensive, but he also says that the Russians have just several months for this offensive. So when talking about just several months of offensive operation, we believe that the Russians, when they take under control all the settlements of the Ukraine that located inside of this red line, most likely the Russians will stop, because to attack further, it will cost a lot. It will be, Russians will pay a significant price just when attacking the city of Sumy. But from these positions, the Russians will be able to shorten the distance to the city of Sumy itself, and it will be much more easier for them to discover and to destroy the temporary deployment points of the armored forces of Ukraine. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of very important updates, and most of them are coming from the southern Kupiansk direction or the Lyman direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. Today we got several updates. The important one took place on the territory of Terny. Today, pro-Ukrainian sources, as you can see, confirmed that the Russians, as a result of offensive, managed to secure the village completely. When talking about other mappers, pro-Russian, neutral mappers, the village of Terny and Yampolovka and Mirne were taken a long time ago by the Russians, and it's very difficult to understand how this gap occurred, why we have so many differences with pro-Ukrainian sources. But anyway, today they confirmed Russian control. I'll remind you that yesterday the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation confirmed control over the settlement by the name of Mirne, not yesterday but on the 25th of March, and the settlement of Yampolovka was taken probably in February or January. Anyway, we see that the Russians are advancing and the Russians are getting closer and closer to Zaporizhia and Toretsk, but this direction of Russian offensive operation is not a priority. It's not the main priority of the Russians. Currently, the main priority of the Russians is to develop their offensive in the northwestern direction towards the settlement by the name of Ritkadub. This settlement is very important for the Russians because this is something like a final settlement before the beginning of huge, let's say, water barrier. So there is a river by the name of Nitrius. This is the river, and this is very important river when talking about defense. So this is the river, and this is how exactly this river goes. As you can see, this river starts at the village of Ritkadub, and this river ends basically with the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass river. So this is something like a wall, and if the Russians, basically the Russians, when attacking the direction of Ritkadub and when talking about further Russian offensive operation, they will do the same as the Ukrainians carried out in 2022. I'll remind you that first of all, during the Ukrainian Kharkiv counteroffensive, first of all, the Ukrainians established control over the settlement by the name of Ritkadub, and then from the village of Ritkadub, the Ukrainians began advancing in the southern direction with the purpose to take under control the settlements of Drobushevo and Lyman. The Ukrainians made lots of attempts to attack Lyman and Drobushevo from the west, but all those attacks were repelled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians couldn't do anything. Only by crossing this water barrier, you can get the benefits and very good positions to attack Lyman and Drobushevo. So now the Russians are trying to do the same. First of all, the Russians are trying to get this settlement, let's say this Ritkadub, and when the Russians answer and take Ritkadub under control, they will do the same as the Ukrainians did in 2022. They will turn in the southern direction, and then the Russians will offensive in Drobushevo and Lyman, and Ukrainians will not be able to show any resistance. So basically, we are like the day before the beginning of the third battle of Lyman. So let's discuss in details what happened during the previous 24 hours. According to information we have, and first was the Ukrainians who published very interesting, let's say, update. Pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians managed to break through and to take under control significant territories. Based on the report of the deep state, we have adjusted just this small part. And furthermore, when talking, and if you take a look at this article published by deep state in details, you're gonna see that they have colored the significant number of territories as a contested area. So the Ukrainians, according to their update, are saying that the Russians, as a result of offensive, managed to enter the southwestern part of Katerinovka. So the sabotage and reconnaissance group and the first assault group of the armored forces of Russian Federation were recorded inside of this red pocket. The Ukrainians colored this territory as a contested area because most likely they had some doubts whether the Russians managed to dig in deeper or not. So, as of course, we don't have any proofs that the Russians were there at all. Anyway, we see that something is happening here, something is brewing here, and we see that the situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult. Later, we got another post article published by neutral mappers, and they got additional details to this picture, and they have adjusted another, let's say, pocket under Russian control. And right before we started making this video, we got another video published by the Russians, and in this video by the Ukrainian story, and in this video we can see how the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in this area. So we have lots of videos, we have lots of proofs that the Russians were there, and that the Russians, as a result of offensive, managed to establish control over this stronghold. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map and we have colored these parts. So as you can see, the progress is significant. And now we see that there are just several strongholds left in front of the Russians before they answer the settlement of Nova itself. Once again, Nova, Ritka-Dub, and then the third battle for Lyman begins. So the situation here for the Ukrainians is very difficult, and this is already Kharkiv direction. This is the northern part of the Donetsk region and the border between Donetsk and Kharkiv region. So right after Ritka-Dub, the Russians can try to attack further in the direction of Barova, because this is also very, let's say, painful position for the Russians, and this Barova could be maybe attacked by the Russians from the south and from the southeast. So from Ritka-Dub, the Russians can advance in this direction, and also the Russians will face no resistance because the Ukrainians don't have strongholds in this part of the Kharkiv region. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation around Toretsk. As for the city of Toretsk itself, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. The Russians were bombing and attacking the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. The Russians were attacking Ukraine's strongholds, temporary deployment points in the fields. So the Russians are preparing this pocket: Alexandra Shultine, Bila Gora, Deliivka, Prichistovka, Nilipovka, before the beginning of a major offensive. I'll remind you, according to our opinion, the general battle is going to take place exactly in this area. Several pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take the village of Pantelimonievka under complete control. This village is located in the southern part of possible area of the general battle. Now let's discuss the situation in the city of Pokrovsk. Today we have report from pro-Ukrainian sources that the Ukrainians managed to restore control over the settlement of Kotlina completely. Based on this report, we have adjusted the map and we have colored this territory as a contested area. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to counterattack the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Uspienovka, to outflank them and to enter the village of Novoalexeyevka. This is a very interesting advance. We still haven't received anything that can confirm this, but if this information is correct, then the Ukrainians can receive a very huge problems in this direction, because without the village of Novoalexeyevka, the Ukrainians will not be able to hold their positions for a very long time in the area of Uspienovka and Salona, and sooner or later the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from this territory and the Russians will restore control over the last villages. And from these positions, the distance between the possible positions of the Russian Federation and the border with Dnipro would be less than 4 kilometers, more precisely 3.2 kilometers, which is already nothing. Furthermore, the Russians resumed their offensive operation in the Dnipro direction. Today, according to different sources, the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to answer the settlement by the name of Bogdanovka. So the Russians reported that they have answered the village and that there are very heavy clashes right now, and if the Russians are able to establish control over this settlement as well, then the distance from these positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and the border would be less than 5 kilometers, around 5 kilometers. So the Russians, as you can see, shortening the distance to the border, and sooner or later they will answer the Dnipro region. As for the South Donetsk direction, currently there are very heavy clashes. The most interesting updates are coming from the village of Rozliv. The Russian sources this morning reported that the first Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group answered the village itself, but as for now, without any proofs, without any proofs from videos or any reliable sources. And another important update: the Russians answered the settlement by the name of Veselaya. There are very heavy clashes, but when talking about this map update, this information was provided us by very reliable sources. So from hour to hour, we are waiting for additional report that we can use to adjust the map in the Russian favor. When talking about the Zaporizhia direction, according to information we have, the Russians improved their positions in the village of Lapkova by taking several buildings and 3 lines under complete control. So once again, as you can see, the Russians have lots of active clashes. Zaporizhia direction, South Donetsk direction, the city of Pokrovsk, the city of Toretsk, Chasov Yar, Siversk, Lyman, Kupiansk, Volchansk, lots of towns where the Russians haven't managed to finish their offensive offensives. And to finish all this offensive, the Russians just need one thing: to get their operational resources from the Sumy direction and to redeploy them in one or another position, in one or another front line. But the Ukrainians understand this as well. So that's why the Ukrainians want to slow down the Russians and to force them to keep their forces here as long as possible. It's not Putin who is trying to win some time. By all these things in the vicinity of Sumy, is Zelensky who is trying to win some time and to hold the Russians in this area for as long as possible. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.